A worn tire changed everything. Not a wiretap, not an informant. A single maintenance receipt, dated November 3, 2023, for a nose gear tire on a plane whose pilot swore he'd been home in bed that night. The plane was tail number XB4471, a 22-year-old Beechcraft King Air 200, registered to a small air taxi outfit in Culiacán, Sinaloa. On paper, it ferried ranchers and mining executives between dirt strips in the north of Mexico. Its logbook was spotless. Its charter invoices looked like every other small operator's paperwork in that part of the country. Insurance current, airworthiness certificate renewed on schedule. Even its exterior told the same boring story. Faded company decals, a chip in the paint along the leading edge of the left wing that had been there so long it had its own entry in 3 separate inspection reports. Nothing about it invited a second look, and that was by design. What the paperwork didn't show was the plane's other life. 3 or 4 nights a month, it lifted off a dirt strip outside Badiraguato, climbed into the dark, and vanished from radar over the Sierra Madre. Hours later, it touched down on an unlit jungle clearing near Sayaxche, in Guatemala's Petén department, engines still turning, while men moved crates into the tree line. The ground crew on those nights worked in near total silence, headlamps taped down to slivers of red light, radios set to a frequency nobody official was monitoring. The whole unload, cargo out, fuel drums in, typically ran under 11 minutes. Anyone who has watched a real-world smuggling operation move cargo will tell you 11 minutes is fast. It's rehearsed. It's a crew that has done this so many times, the choreography has become muscle memory. DEA aviation analysts eventually reconstructed 47 of those runs. Each one, they estimated, carried close to 500 kilograms of cocaine. Add it up and you get a corridor investigators valued at more than $600 million, run out of a plane that looked, to anyone who checked its records, like a beloved family charter service. The case against it wasn't built by chasing the cocaine. Agents never found a kilo on that plane. They built it by chasing the metadata, gaps in transponder pings, a pattern of new tires bought far too often, fuel receipts from strips that had no business seeing regular traffic, and in the end, it was the plane's own paperwork, the same paperwork designed to make it look ordinary, that placed it exactly where its pilot said it had never been. This is the story of how a tired twin-engine turboprop became the clearest map investigators had ever drawn of a cartel's private air bridge, and how the man who flew it became the witness who filled in every name on that map. Sinaloa in 2022 was not short on small aviation companies. Culiacán's general aviation ramp held dozens of King Airs, Cessna Caravans, and Learjets, most of them legitimate, some of them anything but, and almost all of them impossible to tell apart from the tarmac. Aeroservicios Rio Humaya was one of maybe 30 outfits registered at the field, a 3-plane charter company that had been flying agricultural inspectors and cattle buyers around northern Mexico since the late 1990s. It had a small office near the terminal, 2 mechanics on payroll, a dispatcher named Yolanda who'd worked there for 11 years and, as far as investigators could ever determine, had no idea what her employer's night flights actually carried. She thought the special charters were VIP medical transfers, a story the company had apparently told its own staff, as consistently as it told regulators. Its chief pilot was a man named Efrain Solorzano Paz, 51 years old, 26 years in the cockpit. 2 daughters in university in Culiacán, paid for, as far as anyone could tell, entirely by legitimate charter work. He'd flown crop dusters in his 20s, then air ambulance runs through his 30s, the kind of flying that builds a reputation for steady hands under pressure. Neighbors described him as the guy who coached Little League on weekends, who showed up early to chalk the baselines himself. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck that badly needed new shocks and never seemed interested in upgrading it. Nobody who met him thought cartel pilot. That was rather the point. By late 2022, the Sinaloa cartel's cocaine supply chain had a problem money alone couldn't fix. Land routes through Sonora and into Arizona were saturated with checkpoints, drones, and informants. Maritime routes into the Pacific took weeks and depended on ports that U.S. and Mexican naval task forces had gotten uncomfortably good at watching. What the organization needed was something faster and quieter, a way to move product from the interior of Mexico to a jungle staging ground in Central America without ever crossing a border checkpoint that could actually stop it. Small aircraft solved that problem beautifully. A King Air 200 cruises at roughly 300 miles an hour, carries close to 2 tons, and can operate off strips barely 3,000 feet long. Fly it at night, below the coverage floor of most civilian radar, and it becomes close to invisible. Fly it under a spotless charter registration, and even if someone does spot it, there's a perfectly boring explanation sitting in a filing cabinet in Culiacán. That's where Rogelio Campos Beltran came in. Cartel investigators would later describe him as the organization's air logistics coordinator, the man responsible for keeping a rotating fleet of 8 to 12 aircraft flying without drawing attention. Campos Beltran wasn't a trigger man. He was closer to a corporate ops manager who happened to work for narcotics traffickers, someone who understood maintenance schedules, fuel contracts, and airspace gaps better than most legitimate airline dispatchers. Former associates described him to investigators as fastidious to the point of obsession, a man who kept color-coded folders for each aircraft's paperwork and who once, according to one cooperating witness, delayed a run by 6 hours because a fuel receipt had been filled out in the wrong ink color and he worried it would look inconsistent under review. He didn't recruit Solorzano so much as inherit him. Aeroservicios Rio Humaya had already been quietly moving small cash payments for well-connected clients for years before Campos Beltran's people made contact in early 2021, according to court filings that would surface much later. The offer, prosecutors allege, was simple. Keep flying the same routes, add a few special charters, get paid in cash, at roughly 4 times the going rate. For a pilot with 2 tuition bills and a fleet of aging aircraft that needed constant repair, that math was hard to argue with. The first offer, according to Solorzano's later account, came over coffee at a restaurant 2 blocks from the airport, delivered by a man he'd known for years as a legitimate charter customer. No threats, no mention of cartels at all, not explicitly. Just a number, and a question. Could the plane be available on short notice, some nights? No questions asked. He said he thought about it for 3 days before answering. He would later tell investigators that in hindsight, the fact that he was allowed to think about it at all, rather than being told, should have scared him more than it did. What's most surprising about this case isn't the plane, or even the money. It's how boring the crime looked from the outside for almost 2 years. 900 miles north, DEA's Aviation Intelligence Unit had a different kind of problem. Agents there weren't short on suspects. They were drowning in them. Northern Mexico alone had roughly 1,400 registered small aircraft by 2022, and distinguishing the handful moving narcotics from the thousands moving mining equipment and rice farmers required more than a hunch. It required patterns nobody had bothered to look for yet. That changed in March 2022, when an analyst named Priya Anand, working out of DEA's Special Operations Division, started running a routine cross-reference between 2 datasets that had never really talked to each other before. FAA-adjacent flight tracking data, shared under an information agreement with Mexican civil aviation authorities, and maintenance and parts invoices seized in an unrelated 2021 raid on a Culiacán aircraft parts supplier. Anand hadn't set out to find a smuggling plane that week. Her actual assignment was closer to bookkeeping, reconciling parts supplier records against known charter operators to flag counterfeit or gray market aviation parts moving through Sinaloa, a project with nothing to do with narcotics on its face. She'd built a simple spreadsheet model, expected wear part replacement frequency against declared flight hours, flagged anywhere the ratio came out more than 2 standard deviations from the fleet average. Most of the flags in that spreadsheet were nothing. An operator who'd bought spare parts in bulk to get a discount, a company that had simply logged its maintenance sloppily. XB4471 wasn't nothing. Most planes that fly commercial charter routes wear out landing gear tires on a predictable schedule, maybe one set every 800 to 1,000 landings. Anand noticed that XB4471 had gone through 11 nose gear tires in 14 months. For a plane whose official logbook only recorded 96 flights in that window, the math didn't close. And in Anand's experience, math that didn't close usually meant somebody was hiding flights. She flagged the file and, on a hunch, pulled the same ratio for every other aircraft registered to Aeroservicios Rio Humaya's 2 sister companies. 2 more planes came back with similar mismatches, though neither as extreme as XB4471's. That pattern, 3 related companies all showing the same quiet inconsistency, was what finally got the file kicked upstairs instead of filed as a routine parts fraud lead. I spent a long time going through the file on this case, and that one detail kept nagging at me more than almost anything else in it. 11 tires, 96 logged flights. Somebody, somewhere, was flying that plane far more than its own paperwork admitted. Agent Marcus Delgado picked up the case that spring. A 14-year veteran of DEA's aviation interdiction program, Delgado had spent most of his career watching radar screens for planes that disappeared mid-flight, the digital equivalent of a car vanishing off a highway camera. He kept, by his own admission, an almost superstitious habit from his early years on the job, a paper notebook, not a database, where he sketched transponder gaps by hand before ever trusting them to a spreadsheet. He said in a later interview that drawing the gap out longhand made patterns visible that a filtered query sometimes buried. XB4471's transponder gaps fit a signature he'd seen dozens of times: full, normal broadcasting until the aircraft crossed roughly 60 miles south of Culiacán, then nothing for 3 to 5 hours, then a normal signal reappearing on approach back to its home strip. Legitimate charter pilots don't turn off their transponders. Doing so is not just suspicious, it's a felony under both Mexican and U.S. aviation law, which meant somebody on that plane was making a deliberate choice, flight after flight, to become invisible at exactly the moment a normal charter should have been most visible, cruising in daylight over open desert with nothing to hide. The obstacle for Delgado's team wasn't proving something illegal was happening. By mid-2022, that much felt obvious. The obstacle was building a case survivable in a courtroom that hadn't seen the actual cargo, hadn't intercepted a single kilo, and was working almost entirely from documents a defense attorney could dismiss as coincidence. 3 months of surveillance produced exactly 0 photographs of drugs being loaded onto that plane. Not one. Delgado's answer was to stop trying to catch the crime in progress and instead treat the aircraft itself as the witness. Every part replaced, every gallon of fuel purchased, every hour logged, became a data point. If the plane couldn't be caught carrying cocaine, maybe it could be caught lying about where it had been. Through 2023, agents built out what amounted to a shadow logbook for XB4471, cross-referencing 4 separate paper trails: the official flight log Aeroservicios Rio Humaya, filed with Mexican civil aviation authorities, fuel purchase receipts from strips across Sinaloa, Durango, and Chiapas, maintenance invoices from 3 different parts suppliers, and transponder data shared through the Joint Tracking Agreement. None of these existed to catch a smuggler. Each was mundane on its own. Put side by side, they told a story the official logbook never mentioned. By September 2023, Delgado's team had reconstructed what they believed were 31 undocumented flights over 18 months, each one bracketed by a transponder gap, a suspicious fuel purchase near a strip with no scheduled traffic, and, often, a maintenance receipt within days for parts that wear out under heavy, repeated use. 31 flights, nobody outside the cartel was supposed to know about. Here's the part that doesn't quite make sense on the surface. Why keep such meticulous paper records of a smuggling operation at all? The answer, agents would later conclude, is that the records weren't a mistake. They were camouflage. A charter company with sloppy books draws questions. A charter company with immaculate, boring invoices draws none. Campos Beltran's insistence on paperwork discipline was exactly what kept the operation running for years. It was also, eventually, exactly what took it down. What this tells us about cartel logistics in this era is worth sitting with for a second. The old image of narco-trafficking as chaotic, improvised, gun-first, doesn't match what agents actually found here. This was closer to a mid-sized regional airline with a very specific, very illegal cargo. Fuel contracts, scheduled maintenance, payroll. The people running it thought like operations managers because, functionally, that's what they were. Solorzano flew most of those flights himself. Court documents would later describe a pattern. He'd file a normal charter flight plan for a short daytime hop, land, refuel under the legitimate paperwork, then take off again after dark on the real run south, transponder dark, destination a clearing that didn't appear on any chart. He was back on the ground at his home strip, engines cooling, hours before sunrise, to his wife, to his daughters, to the tower controllers who saw the daytime flight plan. Nothing looked wrong. He kept flying it for one uncomfortable reason. The cash had become load-bearing. By his own later testimony, Roughly 70% of his household income by 2023 came from the cartel runs, not the legitimate charters. Pull that income, and 2 tuition payments stop. 2 years of one more flight turned into an income he couldn't walk away from without blowing up his own family's finances. Put yourself in his seat for a second. 4 hours into a night flight, engines humming, nothing on the radio, nothing on the radar, knowing that if this particular run goes wrong, there is no rescue coming. No emergency frequency to call, no flight plan on file to tell anyone where to look, just the dark and the jungle and whatever is waiting at the other end of it. To understand what one of those runs actually looked like from inside the cockpit, investigators later reconstructed the night of August 19, 2023, almost minute by minute, using a combination of transponder gap timing, fuel receipts, and Solorzano's own later testimony. He took off from a private strip outside Culiacán at 8:04 p.m. under a filed flight plan for a short hop to Los Mochis, a plan he never intended to complete. 22 minutes into the flight, once clear of the last radar station with reliable low-altitude coverage, he switched the transponder to standby, a 2-second action that legally transformed a routine charter into a felony in progress. He flew the next 3 hours and 40 minutes at 9,500 feet, low enough to stay under most commercial radar coverage but high enough to clear the Sierra Madre's higher ridgelines, navigating largely by GPS waypoints Campos Beltran's people had provided, rather than any filed route. He described the strip near Sayaxche, once he found it in the dark, as barely visible until the ground crew below flashed a single handheld light 3 times, the agreed signal that it was safe to land. He put the King Air down on a grass and dirt clearing he'd never seen in daylight, on a runway he estimated from feel rather than instruments, because there were no runway lights and no instrument approach for a strip that officially didn't exist. By late 2023, Delgado's team had 31 flights mapped and a strong circumstantial case. What they didn't have yet was a single moment they could put in front of a jury and say, "Here, this is the lie, this is where the story falls apart." That moment was 3 months away, and it would come from the most unglamorous piece of evidence in the entire file. A tire. Guatemala's Petén department is one of the least monitored patches of airspace in the hemisphere. A green expanse of jungle and Maya ruins the size of Belgium, with maybe a dozen radar-covered airports and thousands of square miles that see none. It's also, not coincidentally, one of the busiest unofficial transshipment zones in the region, a place where cocaine moving north pauses before continuing on toward Mexico and, eventually, the United States. Guatemala's National Civil Police had flagged the clearing near Sayaxche as far back as 2019, after villagers reported hearing aircraft engines at odd hours with no corresponding traffic at the nearest legal airstrip 40 miles away. Nothing came of it at the time. Small departments with limited aviation assets can't chase every rumor of a night flight in a country with this much unmonitored jungle. What changed in 2023 was that DEA's Guatemala City Country Office started sharing Delgado's flight reconstructions with Guatemalan counterparts, and the clearing near Sayaxche lit up as a match. Satellite imagery requested for October and November 2023 showed disturbed vegetation consistent with repeated light aircraft landings, a pattern invisible to the naked eye, from ground level but obvious once someone knew where to point a camera. That gave investigators a location. It didn't give them a date they could prove beyond argument, until the tire invoice surfaced. On November 3, 2023, a parts supplier in Culiacán logged an invoice for a replacement nose gear tire on XB4471, paid in cash, delivered and installed the following morning. Ordinary enough, except that when agents cross-referenced Solorzano's personal phone records for the surrounding 48 hours, subpoenaed under a Mexican judicial cooperation order, his phone had pinged a cell tower near his home in Culiacán at 11:40 p.m. on the night in question, exactly when he later told investigators he'd been home with his family, hadn't flown in 3 days. A nose gear tire doesn't wear out sitting on a ramp. It wears out on landing, and specifically on hard landings on unimproved surfaces, exactly the kind of touchdown a dirt clearing in the Petén produces. The tire said the plane had been flown hard, recently, on rough ground. Solorzano's own statement said it hadn't left Culiacán in days. One of those two things was a lie. And a maintenance invoice, dated, itemized, paid for in cash but still logged for tax purposes, because Aeroservicios Rio Humaya was, on paper, a real business that needed real books, doesn't have a motive to lie the way a pilot facing decades in prison does. Delgado's team spent December 2023 quietly closing the gap between the tire receipt and the satellite imagery. Cell tower data placed Solorzano's phone, tellingly, in airplane mode for a 6-hour window that same night, a detail that meant nothing on its own, but fit the pattern of every confirmed cartel run in the file. The transponder logs showed the familiar gap. The fuel receipts showed a purchase at a strip outside Chetumal, near the Belize border, a common refueling stop on the route south. 4 independent, mundane paper trails, and every one of them contradicted the pilot's own account of that night. Before the sting could move forward, all of that scattered paper had to become something a court could actually use, and that job fell to an evidence unit most people never think about when they picture a DEA investigation. In a converted warehouse space outside Tucson, a small team led by a forensic document examiner named Renata Ibarra spent 6 weeks in late 2023 doing nothing but cataloging. Every fuel receipt, every maintenance invoice, every satellite image, every transponder log entry, scanned, time-stamped, cross-indexed into a single chain of custody database that a defense attorney would eventually be given full access to, because the entire case depended on that paperwork surviving exactly the kind of scrutiny it was about to face. Ibarra's team flagged something Delgado's field agents had missed. 3 of the fuel receipts, all from the same strip outside Chetumal, had been written by 2 different hands, but signed with what appeared to be the same signature. It took a document examiner with training in forgery detection to notice that the signature on 2 of the 3 receipts had been traced rather than written freehand. The pen strokes too uniform, the pressure too consistent for a human hand signing quickly at a fuel pump. It meant someone at that strip was pre-signing blank receipts in batches, a small operational shortcut that, once identified, gave investigators an entirely new lead, a fuel supplier who either knew exactly what he was enabling or had simply never asked. That supplier, when eventually interviewed under a cooperation arrangement of his own, filled in 3 more names investigators hadn't had before. Here's the part that rarely makes it into how these cases get told afterward. The dramatic arrest gets the headline. The 6 weeks of a document examiner squinting at ink pressure under a loupe in a windowless warehouse is what actually made the arrest possible. And it's the part almost nobody outside the file ever hears about. By January 2024, prosecutors in both Mexico and the U.S. Southern District of Florida, where a related grand jury investigation into Campos Beltran's network had quietly been running since mid-2023, agreed the case was strong enough to move. The plan wasn't a dramatic tarmac raid. It was a sting. DEA's Guatemala country office, working with an informant embedded in a separate but connected trafficking cell, arranged for a special charter request to reach Aeroservicios Rio Humaya through the same cartel channels that normally booked the real runs. A supposed medical evacuation flight requiring a landing at Santa Elena Airport near Flores, Petén, on the night of January 9, 2024. It should have been routine. It wasn't. 20 minutes before Solorzano was due to depart Culiacán for what he believed was a legitimate, paying charter, word reached the operation that Guatemalan authorities had unexpectedly rotated their normal airport security detail that week. A scheduling change, unrelated to the case, but one that risked spooking the pilot into aborting before he ever left the ground. Delgado's team had built an entire operation around a fixed plan, and now the ground had shifted under them with no time to adjust through normal channels. The fix came from the Guatemalan National Civil Police liaison officer working the case, who quietly arranged for the newly rotated detail to stand down from the ramp entirely for the relevant 90-minute window, leaving the arrest team, already positioned and waiting, as the only visible presence at the airport when the King Air taxied in. It was the kind of last-minute improvisation that either saves an operation or destroys it. Here, it held. The arrest team itself had rehearsed the approach twice that afternoon in a hangar borrowed from a local charter operator, walking through exactly where each officer would stand once the King Air's props stopped turning, who would approach the cockpit door, who would cover the tail in case a second person was aboard. 6 officers in total, positioned in a loose arc around the apron, deliberately spaced to avoid clustering near the fuel truck that would normally be waiting for a real medevac flight. since a cluster of unfamiliar vehicles near the ramp was exactly the kind of visual cue that had aborted similar operations elsewhere in the region in years past. At 9:52 p.m. local time, XB4471 touched down at Santa Elena. Solorzano taxied to the general aviation apron, engines still spinning down, expecting to meet a ground crew for what he'd been told was a medevac pickup. Instead, Guatemalan National Civil Police officers, working alongside DEA agents observing under diplomatic clearance, moved in and took him into custody without incident. He didn't fight it. According to the arrest report, his first words to the arresting officer were simply, "I knew this day would come." Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. Solorzano wasn't some cartel foot soldier who deserves no sympathy at all. He was a career pilot with a spotless record for 2 decades, who made a calculated, informed choice to keep flying cocaine runs for 2 straight years because the money solved a problem he didn't want to solve any other way. That's not innocence. It's also not the same thing as the men who built the network he flew for. The system tends to flatten both into cartel pilot, and honestly, that flattening does a disservice to understanding how operations like this one actually recruit and retain people. The interrogation itself began roughly 4 hours after the arrest, once Solorzano had been transferred from the airport to a Guatemalan National Civil Police facility in Flores and, at his own request, allowed a brief phone call to a Mexican defense attorney, a cousin had recommended years earlier, for an unrelated matter. What followed wasn't the kind of interrogation people picture from television. No raised voices, no threats. Delgado, who sat in on the session alongside a Guatemalan investigator and a Spanish-language interpreter for the record, even though Solorzano's English was serviceable, later described it as closer to a long, exhausted conversation between 2 men who both already knew how the math worked out. Solorzano was shown, early in that first session, the tire invoice and the cell tower data side by side, the exact contradiction that had built the case against him. Agents call this a confrontation exhibit, a piece of evidence laid out not to threaten, but to demonstrate that further denial has become pointless. He looked at the 2 documents, according to Delgado's account, for what felt like a full minute without speaking. Then he asked a single question: how long had they known? When Delgado told him roughly 8 months, Solorzano reportedly laughed, not from amusement, but from something closer to relief, and said that explained why, in his words, flying started to feel different this year, like someone was already watching. What happened over the following 11 days surprised even the prosecutors who'd built the case. Solorzano, facing a Mexican federal trafficking charge that under recent sentencing guidelines could have kept him imprisoned into his 80s, began cooperating with DEA and Guatemalan investigators within 72 hours of his arrest, well before any formal plea agreement had been finalized. What he gave them went far beyond his own flights. He identified Campos Beltran by name and described his role in granular detail. Fuel contracts negotiated with 3 separate suppliers across Sinaloa and Chiapas, a rotating fleet of 9 aircraft he personally knew about, and a network of at least 6 other pilots flying similar routes under similarly spotless charter registrations. He described a ledger, kept not by the cartel directly, but by a Culiacán accountant, who handled consulting fees for several legitimate-looking aviation businesses, that agents would later use to trace roughly $47.5 million in laundered proceeds through 4 shell companies and 2 ranch properties outside Culiacán. Would you have flipped that fast, facing that many years? It's an easy question to answer from the outside. It's a much harder one at 3 a.m., in a Guatemalan holding cell with 2 daughters back home, who have no idea yet that their father isn't coming back from this trip. His younger daughter, a second-year architecture student at the time, later told a Mexican journalist covering the case, on condition her name not be published, that the family learned about the arrest not from a phone call, but from a local news alert on her phone during a lecture, a photograph of her father's charter company's hangar with police tape across the entrance. She said she sat through the rest of the class because she didn't know what else to do, then walked out into the parking lot and called her sister, who hadn't seen the news yet either. Neither of them, she said, ever suspected the family's tuition money came from anywhere but the charter business their father talked about constantly, proudly, at every family dinner. That detail sits uneasily against everything else in this case. A man who spent 2 years building a second, secret income stream, specifically so his daughters would never have to know where any of it came from. The information moved fast. On February 14, 2024, a coordinated operation involving Mexican Federal Police, Guatemalan National Civil Police, and DEA agents executed simultaneous search warrants at 4 properties linked to Campos Beltran across Culiacán and neighboring Navolato. Agents recovered 2 additional aircraft, a King Air 350 and a Cessna Caravan, both registered to Shell charter companies with the same paperwork-heavy, suspiciously boring profile as Aeroservicios Rio Humaya. They also recovered roughly $6.2 million in cash across the 4 properties and a set of encrypted phones that, once cracked with cooperation from a regional cybercrime unit, contained flight coordination messages going back to early 2021. Campos Beltran himself wasn't at any of the 4 properties when the warrants executed. He'd left Culiacán 11 days earlier, the same day Solorzano's arrest made contact with Cartel channels through the network's own internal warning system, a detail that told investigators the organization still had operational security discipline even as it started to come apart. For 6 weeks, his location was unknown, and the case's momentum stalled on the single open question that mattered most. Would the man who built the operation simply disappear, the way so many cartel logistics figures have before him? He didn't disappear. On March 28, 2024, Guatemalan authorities, acting on a tip that agents believe originated from within Campos Beltran's own weakened network, arrested him at a hotel in Petén's departmental capital, Flores, roughly 9 miles from the Che clearing his planes had used for years. He was traveling under a false identity, carrying $340,000 in cash and a Guatemalan passport with a name that matched no birth record anywhere in the country's civil registry. Would you have noticed the signs before it was too late, if you'd been the hotel clerk who checked him in that week? Probably not. That's rather the point of the entire operation he ran. Ordinary, until it very much wasn't. The indictment, unsealed in the Southern District of Florida on June 11, 2024, named 14 defendants, Campos Beltran chief among them, on charges spanning cocaine importation conspiracy, money laundering, and aircraft registration fraud. Prosecutors valued the total corridor the network had run, using Solorzano's reconstructed flight data as the evidentiary backbone, at over $600 million in wholesale cocaine value across just the 47 confirmed flights, a number that almost certainly undercounts the network's full lifespan, given it only covers the period agents could document with hard paper trails. Away from the courtrooms and the seized ledgers, there's a smaller story that rarely makes it into coverage of cases like this one. The village nearest the Che clearing itself. Investigators who spent time there in early 2024, coordinating with Guatemalan authorities on the search that eventually confirmed the landing site, described a community of roughly 400 people who had lived beside that unofficial airstrip for years, without ever calling it that. Residents knew the engine noise. They knew not to walk that stretch of jungle after dark on certain nights. An unspoken rule nobody remembered agreeing to. Just something everyone understood the way you understand not to swim past the buoys. One farmer, interviewed through a translator and granted anonymity for his safety, said his family's land bordered the clearing and that men had shown up 8 years earlier, offering a modest but steady monthly payment simply for staying quiet and keeping their dogs penned on certain nights. He took the money. He said he assumed, at the time, it was something to do with smuggled goods crossing from Belize, not cocaine flown in from 600 miles away. By the time he understood the real scale of what had been landing behind his cornfield, he said, the money had already paid off his family's debts twice over, and stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. It's a detail that complicates the story in an uncomfortable way. The network didn't just corrupt pilots and accountants. It quietly wove itself into the economic survival of an entire rural community that had no real choice in the matter, once the arrangement began. There's a line in Solorzano's later plea allocution that reads almost like something out of a novel, and it stuck with me more than almost anything else in this case. Asked by the judge why he kept flying after the first year, when he must have known the risk was only compounding, he said, I told myself every flight would be the last one. I told myself that 11 times. 11 times. Almost exactly matching the 11 suspicious tire replacements that first put an analyst on his trail 2 years earlier. Neither side in the courtroom seemed to notice the coincidence. It's the kind of detail that only means something if you've spent time with the whole file. Campos Beltran was extradited to the United States in September 2024, following an expedited process under the existing U.S.-Guatemala extradition treaty. He pleaded not guilty at arraignment and has remained in federal custody since, with trial currently scheduled for early 2026. Prosecutors have indicated they intend to use the seized encrypted communications, the $47.5 million money trail, and Solorzano's testimony as the core of their case. His defense team has signaled it will challenge the admissibility of the reconstructed flight data itself, arguing that a case built primarily on maintenance invoices and fuel receipts, rather than direct evidence of narcotics, rests on inference stacked on inference. Prosecutors, for their part, seem confident the paper trail's sheer consistency across independent, unconnected sources is exactly what makes it hard to explain away as coincidence. Argument that will likely become the defining legal question of the trial itself. Solorzano himself pleaded guilty in Mexican federal court in October 2024 to trafficking and aircraft registration fraud charges. Under a cooperation agreement, reflecting his assistance in identifying the broader network, he received a sentence of 6 years, a fraction of what he could have faced, with credit for time served and eligibility for parole consideration after 3. His daughters, both still enrolled at university in Culiacán, have not spoken publicly about the case. Unpopular opinion, maybe. 6 years feels light for a man who personally flew nearly half a ton of cocaine into a jungle clearing, more than 24 times over 2 years. But it's also the 6 years that broke the case wide open and led directly to Campos Beltran's arrest, the $47.5 million seizure, and the identification of 6 other pilots now under active investigation. Without that plea, none of the rest of this happens. Justice, in cases like this, is rarely a clean number. It's usually a trade. Is that trade fair? Genuinely curious what you think, because prosecutors clearly weighed it as worth making, and not everyone would agree. Aeroservicios Rio Humaya's operating certificate was revoked by Mexican civil aviation authorities in July 2024. XB4471 itself, the plane at the center of all of it, was formally seized as an instrumentality of trafficking and remains in DEA custody in Arizona, where agents have used it, ironically, as a training reference for exactly the kind of maintenance pattern analysis that first cracked the case. New analysts working the aviation intelligence program now go through what the unit informally calls the tire briefing, a case study built entirely around Anand's original spreadsheet, before they're allowed to run their own cross-referencing queries against live data. The 6 additional pilots Solorzano identified remain under investigation as of this writing. 2 have reportedly left Mexico for destinations investigators haven't publicly disclosed. Whether the remaining 4 continue flying similar routes for whatever remains of the network's logistics apparatus is, as of mid-2026, still an open question nobody in the case files has answered. We cut a fair amount of detail from this story for length, including the specifics of how agents cross-referenced the fuel receipts across 3 states, which honestly could be its own 20-minute video on its own. If you want that follow-up, drop a comment and we'll put it together. What strikes us most about this entire case, looking back at it now, isn't the plane, or the money, or even the 11 tires that gave it away. It's how completely ordinary the operation looked from the outside for 2 straight years, and how the thing that finally exposed it wasn't a wiretap or a raid or an informant walking into a field office. It was a stack of boring, itemized invoices that somebody was required by ordinary tax law to keep, sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time, waiting for the right analyst to notice the math didn't add up. That's the uncomfortable lesson buried in this one. The paperwork designed to make an operation invisible is often the exact paperwork that eventually undoes it. Because paper trails, unlike people, don't get nervous, don't change their story, and don't stop existing just because someone would very much like them to. XB4471 flew 47 documented runs before a tire brought the whole thing down. Nobody involved, not Solorzano, not Campos Beltran, not the analyst who first noticed 11 tires against 96 flights, thought that's how this particular story would end. If you want to see how a different aviation case broke open, the one involving 3 altered flight logs and a mechanic who kept a second, secret notebook, we've got that story queued up next. Subscribe if you want it the moment it's live, And let us know down in the comments which detail in this one got you the most, because for us, it was always the tires.